Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Ruth McCambridge, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Nonprofit Quarterly. Today, we're presenting a workshop called Is Your Board Structured for Impact? And this is part 2 of an exclusive deep dive into BoardSource's latest report, Leading with Intent. We're thrilled to present this series of 4 discussions on these important findings with BoardSource's leadership team. Over many decades, the nonprofit sector has been besieged with advice on their board structures, and too much of this has been based on false precepts about what ideal nonprofit boards should look and act like. This has led to a great deal of board underperformance and even outright dysfunction. As a result, nonprofits are becoming increasingly thoughtful about how form fits function and intent how form fits function and intent in these important bodies. This allows us all to consider and tailor board design more consciously, but to do this, we need to understand structural design principles. To help us think about these principles and how they can help us pay attention to what matters to board members and executives and board management, we have Ann Wallestad, BoardSource's CEO, in the green shirt. Say hi, Ann. Vernetta Walker, BoardSource's Chief Governance Officer and Vice President of Programs, and a special guest, David Renz, Director of the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. Don't forget to join us for parts 2 and 3 and 4 of this important discussion to be held on November 14th and December 12th of this year. We'll be sure to notify you when registration is available. Today's webinar is brought to you by Board Effect. Board Effect is passionate about the work of boards, which guides how they develop the Board Effect solutions. Board Effect's board management software drives efficiency, effectiveness, and engagement among directors, executives, and administrators. Hospitals, nonprofit foundations, educational institutions, government entities, companies, and many others use Board Effects to put board books online and advance the work of their governing bodies. This webinar will be recorded, so don't ask me that. That's always the question we get, like, multiple times. It will be shared with all attendees shortly after the meeting. We will also make the recording freely available on our website, along with PowerPoint slides, so that they can be accessed at any time. I do want to say that for those of you who find this really useful and think it might be useful to share with your board members, please feel free to use it in that way. It's here to be an educational and discussion tool. We will leave time for questions at the end, so if you think of one, please post it in the chat box at the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll respond after the presentation. I do want to say that we're going to go an hour and leave some extra time at the end, so we're actually going for about an hour and a half, or as long as we have questions, to make sure that we can attend to more of them than we've been able to lately, because our presentations have been extending a little long, and that means we haven't been able to answer as many questions. So today we're going to leave it open for a while past the hour point, up into an hour and a half, and see if we can answer more of your questions. Finally, we're on social media, so you can follow today's conversation with our hashtag #BuildYourBoard. Feel free to post questions or comments during or after the presentation in the questions panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Today, we are starting with a presentation by David Renz, moving on to Ann Wallestad presenting the report's findings. Vernetta Walker and David Renz will respond to those findings, and then at the end, we will move to your questions. So again, welcome. I'm looking forward to this discussion, and I'm going to hand it over to David, who's obviously very smart, because look at all of his books.
He didn't even clean up the office. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm pleased to join our colleagues from both the quarterly and BoardSource to talk about leading with intent. This is an interesting topic, as Ruth alluded to, because we're talking about structure, but in a sense, structure is only the observable pieces that we see after critical decisions have been made. And so we'll be raising that point a few times today as we think about both the relevance of the structures, but also what do they mean a little bit more deeply. Structures are clues as much as they are findings. And when I look at this report, I try to keep that in perspective. It gives us a sense of an important principles, design concepts, sometimes intentionally developed, unfortunately sometimes not, but the principles can't be articulated in a report like this. We mostly see the indicators of them. And it's like the tip of the iceberg. The largest share of what's really going on, and often is most important, is what's below the surface. So our job is to interpret them. The data and the results highlight topics and questions for us to consider. And that, of course, is why it's great that the report also has a section labeled Opportunities for Reflection. For me, a metaphor of this might be something that many folks have seen, a salary and benefits survey report. Those reports give us numbers about compensation and benefits, but they don't tell us anything about what principles, challenges, and concept the organizations that adopted those pay structures actually were working with. The same is true for our boards and systems of governance. The reality is, for those of us who are in organizational studies, we look at data like this and try to understand it in the context of the operating environment. Organizations exist in a balance with their environment. When they don't, they disappear. And so there isn't anything that's automatically a right structure, because until you understand the context and where things are moving to, you can't really judge good or bad. And again, that's why we're saying the data here in today's report offers clues and hints, but we should be working with that. An illustration of that, for example, might be the kind of organization that we have and its revenue model. A typical structure that boards often talk about is a fundraising or a development committee. But of course, you wouldn't expect to see a development committee in an organization whose revenues were 100% based on government funding, taxes or fees, something like that. So the fact that many organizations have a development committee simply tells us that many do, but that's for them. Similarly, if you in fact operate 100% on philanthropic support, you probably need to have that development committee. And so let's think about what the report tells us by trying to keep these things in mind. The perspectives that are being shared here are implied as much as they are articulated. Now, I do want to also note, and Ann will talk a little more about this in a minute, in the methods section of the report, BoardSource notes that this is a convenient sample, and so we see a lot of data that is generalized across a fairly significant range of organizations. The response rate is good, and so there's a lot of data and you can do much with it. That said, the numbers that we're highlighting in this short presentation today, frankly, blur some boundaries. 64% of the organizations responding to the survey are public charities. 8% were foundation. And as you can imagine, the operating environment for a foundation is different from an operating charity, so we'd expect to see some differences there. 9% of the organizations responding were associations. And again, you can imagine just by thinking about organizations that associations you've been a part of. They're going to have some different structures because the imperatives and principles behind their design are going to be different. Further, 19% of the organizations responding were actually other kinds of organizations, including certain kinds of governmental entities. And again, they're going to look different. And so our goal is to share information that invites you to tease out the significance and the implications. Let me now hand the presentation to Anne. She'll share more about the survey and help us begin to think about these.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Renz. So I want to share just a little bit more, and I appreciate the context about the methodology. I want to share a little bit more about what leading with intent is, and also, to your point, what it is not. So this is a study that BoardSource does roughly every 2 years, and we are focused in looking at snapshots of board composition, culture, and performance. So what's really happening with boards. We first started doing this type of research, though it has certainly morphed and changed over the years, in 1994. And each time we do the study, it is a moment in time snapshot of board strengths and challenges, composition, et cetera. It's important to note that even though we do try and look at, how have those snapshots changed over time, this is not a longitudinal study. It is not a stable sample. It's not the same groups of organizations each year. So there are limitations in terms of looking at trends, just as Dr. Renz has pointed out. And similar, the convenient sample brings limitations with it as well. The full report is available at leadingwithintent.org. It covers many other topics beyond what we're going to focus on today, and even that we're focusing on as a part of this 4-part webinar series partnership with NPQ. And I encourage you to pull it down if you're interested in learning more, including that final section that Dr. Renz mentioned on opportunities for reflection and discussion for boards, which is really designed to help individual boards and leaders make sense of the findings and what they might mean for their organizations specifically. So we talked a little bit about the data set, but I just want to give some numbers on that in terms of who was included in the study. So I won't spend a lot of time here, but as Dr. Renz pointed out, this is a mixed sample in terms of public charities, foundations, and other types of organizations, and you can see the distribution there. It's also important to note that we ask questions of both executives and, when possible, board chairs. So we have responses from both executives about the board and structure and performance, as well as board chairs. And you'll see in the findings that there's some interesting things that we can look at when we're comparing those sets of responses from both executives and board chairs. It's not a comparison within organizations, it's simply an aggregate. Moving to the next slide, I mentioned that Leading with Intent looks at a number of different components of board structure, board performance, board composition. We structure the report into 4 main sections. So first we look at who is actually serving on boards and how are they organized. Then we spent some time asking questions about and analyzing responses to the questions related to board culture. What's really happening in the space between board members and how are board members interacting and working together. Then we look at the work of the board and how well they're doing it, where there are struggles. And then finally, and this is new in this year's study, we look at perceptions of board impact. So asking questions of both board chairs and executives about the perceived impact of the board on organizational performance. And while those are all perceptions, so there are limitations in terms of how much we can read into that, there are some interesting insights in terms of what board chairs and executives think matter most. And what their responses indicate matter most, at least in terms of their perceptions of board impact. So there are some new insights and findings there that are pretty interesting. So with that, digging into that question of what matters most, this next slide that you're seeing, this looks at of all of the work characteristics and the culture characteristics. So the questions that we asked related to those 2 categories. What had the strongest relationships to perceived board impact on organizational performance for both chief executives and board chairs. And it's really important to note, this is not causation. We can't say that. We can only say that it seems that for executives and board chairs, these are the things that are most closely related to their perceptions of board impact on organizational performance. And given the conversation that we're having today about board structure and structuring the board for impact, we've highlighted the things that stand out there in terms of meeting structure and the way that the board is organized. So you see on the left-hand side, based on chief executive responses, there seems to be a strong relationship between the board's impact on organizational performance, and again, perceptions, and the extent to which board members are prepared for board meetings. From board chairs, we heard that the strongest relationships were about board members receiving information in advance of the meeting and well-run meetings that begin and end on time and use clear agendas, good facilitation, et cetera. So I want to pause here and just invite my co-panelists. What do you make of this?
So I'll jump in and say a couple of things in terms of what matters. And I'm looking at the board chair responses. Meeting run well, effective meeting practices, clear agenda, good facilitation, start and end on time. And I can read a lot of things into that. And for me, I like, when I work with boards or organizations, I want them to focus not just on process, but on substance. So having the right information, that's great. But and all boards, they want these, I guess, characteristics. They want these things in their meetings. But let me give you an example of a board that thought that their meetings were, perfect, that it worked well. But when we dug into it, it's like, okay, where's the substance? This particular board, they would meet once a month, and it was for 1 hour at noon over lunch. And what they really liked, they would show up, the pizza or sandwiches were there. The executive director would start the meeting, actually the chair would welcome everyone, start the meeting. So they would start on time, and if they ended at 5 minutes to 1, that was a great meeting. But in between, and I was sitting in one of these meetings, I'm waiting on the substance. That entire meeting, I never heard from a single board member except for the chair when she welcomed everyone. After that, it was a report from the executive director, another staff member, back to the executive director. Now, I must say, these board members, they showed up. They were being fed information, and they thought it was a good meeting. So when I look at these traits or characteristics, what matters most, they were happy that it started on time. They were happy that it ended on time. I think they were happy that someone else was facilitating the meeting, that they didn't really have to do much except for weigh in towards the end, kind of nod their heads, but that was it. And we need so much more. So that's just my opening statement with how I see this information. Got to have process, but you also have to have the substance.
You end up with a lot of form over substance in these conditions. And it's unfortunate because some people do use that as a basis for judging effectiveness. You need to understand that, but of course it's not especially relevant. I think the slide is interesting because it highlights several kinds of structures. The fact of the matter is a meeting is a structure, an agenda is a structure for the meeting. Board roles and responsibilities are articulated by some kind of structure. It's usually provided by a board or by the bylaws, assuming somebody read them. And one of the points that was flagged in the culture characteristics was the reference to board working as a collaborative team. The fact that you're even thinking about the board as a team or not, that's a structural question. And this is where the chicken and egg part of this can emerge, because how you structure it will affect whether it serves as a real team or not. And some of these other pieces, and we'll get to other ingredients later, have an impact on that dynamic. But structures there are better and worse structures for each situation. And I think boards often go for the simple judgment like you're describing, Bernetta.
What's interesting to me as well, and I think, David, in your opening remarks, you were talking about structure, and it's going to depend on, where the organization is. And I was just thinking, maybe you didn't say this. I know I was thinking it in my mind in terms of their life cycle, their size, all the things that make an organization. What I'm seeing that's really interesting is that younger organizations, and I don't mean that in terms of the age of the people, but the organization itself, when it was founded, I'm finding that younger organizations are much more flexible with their structure. They're not tied to whatever was put in the bylaws maybe 50 years ago. So they're thinking differently about how they do their work, how they come together. And I'm just seeing, I'm just starting to see this, I should say. I'm just starting to see organizations that are much more open to creating something that works for them.
I like that point. And one of the things we're seeing in general is that organizations across the board are decreasing the sort of intensity and fine layering of structures in favor of more processes that are more responsive to the evolving needs. Now, sometimes that confuses or bothers people because they feel like things aren't as much under control. In one sense, they're not. But that goes back to that environment organization match. If the environment is dynamic and shifting quickly, then you can't adopt a structure that's fine-tuned that will be responsive and keep you in sync with it. And that's even before you think about what's your next generation of work. And the truth is, structures are often looked to guarantee performance, but structures don't guarantee performance. They can't, and they often get in the way, and people don't even see it because it's kind of like, well, we followed the agenda, we met the timeline, and to your point, we ended at 5 minutes early. You got to love a meeting that's run well. But our definition of well, it's kind of like compliance rather than real impact.
Well, that's probably a good place to advance to the next slide, which shows us, in general, across the board, what board members, board chairs, and executives are saying in terms of the quality of their board meetings. So previously, we were looking at what did they think mattered most in terms of the board's impact on organizational performance. These are straight frequencies of what did they actually say about their own board. So you can see, as you go down, to what extent board chairs and executives are saying that board members are prepared, that meetings focus on strategy and policy, getting to that point of actual substance and the work that's happening within board meetings, that meetings allow time for discussion rather than simply reporting, that meetings are well run, and that the board receives necessary information. And you can see some really wide ranges in terms of what board chairs and executives are reporting in terms of to the extent to which these things are happening. The highest scores you see are on the board receiving the necessary information. The lowest scores you're seeing are the extent to which board members are prepared. Going to the next slide, this looks at how the relationship between board culture and meeting structure and practices. So again, not causation, but looking at what did executives and board chairs see, what did their responses show in terms of connections and relationships between these things. So these are the things on the left that executives were saying through their responses were most related to positive board culture, and then board chairs. I'm interested to invite your thoughts and feedback on this.
I'll let you start, Dave.
Okay. Well, I'd have to go back to the point I made earlier. These are all the sort of tips of the iceberg that are sticking up over the waterline, and they imply some things that are important, but they all grow out of the a deeper structure that we need to understand. One of my concerns is that we look at structure and think it's driving these things, when in fact culture is a much deeper and more powerful force. In fact, the cliche in my world, many people have probably heard it, is that culture will eat strategy for lunch any day. And culture will override any structure when people feel like they're inconsistent. So the interesting thing is structures do influence culture, but mostly culture is deeper and more powerful. And I know, Vernetta, you've seen this in your practice as you've worked with organizations and boards as well. The thing that I worry about is that these are some symptoms, but for example, a lot of board engagement issues derive from having too many meetings or structuring the timing and the length of them so that people either can't or won't participate. And then we don't get what we really need out of the meetings. That said, a lot of boards haven't really thought about what do we need from the meetings that we're holding. One of the things I'm reminded of, and excuse me for drawing on some information and research that my former colleague Bob Herman worked on, but he and Dick Heimovix developed a research study to look at executive behavior, and they highlighted the notion they called board-centered executive leadership. They highlighted the fact that highly effective CEOs are good at enabling and supporting their boards as they proceed to do their work. In fact, rather than saying, well, it's the board's job, I hope they do a good job, these executives actually embrace the responsibility for supporting and facilitating the work of board. And that means creating certain little structures or hidden structures, like things implied in the slide. Is the information going out on time? Do we have a good agenda? Our other structure, even for how people participate and what they understand about their roles, are they there? And we do find, one of my favorite pieces of research from a couple of years ago was a finding that both employees and volunteers drop out of their workplace when their roles are not clear. That was implied in a previous slide. But again, board meetings occur in a much larger context. And I think we want to look at these points and say, what helped get us to there?
I like the idea of, what helped get us there. And when I look at this, just at face value, one of the things that, and it's, I guess it's pretty much the point I made before, but what really comes to mind is how the structure, while everything on this list makes sense, that you should have quality board meetings if you have this going on, you can actually have a structure that blocks the opportunity for the quality. So for example, you may have board members who are prepared. They have read everything, they come, they're ready to discuss it, but the agenda doesn't provide that opportunity to engage in a thoughtful or meaningful discussion. So for the executive director saying, yeah, board members are prepared, we sent everything out, the meeting was well facilitated, sometimes we're our own worst enemy. I'll give you a more concrete example. There was a board that was very focused on really engaging in the 3 modes of governance that I talked about in governance is leadership. And they wanted to have some generative discussions. They teed it up. A lot of material was shared. They've been talking about this for a while. And then when they came to the meeting, the structure of that meeting, every board member was going to have 60 seconds to participate in the generative discussion. Like truly going around the table, you get 60 seconds, you get 60 seconds. And that was the generative discussion. The book, yeah, that doesn't work. so I would say the caution is, I love it that they're focused on what they need, but then take a step back and see your description of many structures to make things work. Look at the big picture. So the many structures in the big picture, instead of just checking the list. Yep, we started, we ended on time, everybody read the materials. How are you really engaging? And so, and the culture piece is a part of it. Once the board is operating as a team and they recognize, you know what, we have value to add. So how do we infuse this and create a structure that works for us?
I'm curious to invite your feedback. Would you say, and this is obviously the data don't tell us this, but would you say that these things that are being surfaced by the study are kind of baseline? These are important things to exist, but they are not an endpoint in themselves? Or do you think that it's questionable whether or not these things matter at all? Can you have a successful board where you're not focused on strategy and policy? Or can you have a successful board where board members are not prepared? Just curious.
I think these things are important, definitely, but it's not the end of the story. So I don't think you can have a successful meeting where board members are not prepared. You just, again, it gets back to there's no substance there. But you can have board members who are prepared and not have a successful meeting. So they are important.
I think it reminds me of evaluation practice and logic models. There are inputs to a successful process, and then there are the activities by which we engage those inputs. And if we do that well and effectively, ideally it will generate outputs, and good outputs over time will accumulate to actual outcomes and benefit, impact. And these items are important, but they're more on the input and activity end of the continuum. And what you're getting, of course, with the perceptions of impact is a hint of the outcome side. But, part of this actually reminds me of, was your earlier webinar, but the difference between diversity and inclusion and the fact that having the right ingredients around the table, having the right group around the table, and never having a structure and in a process that allows you to engage them, okay, that doesn't do much. It's better than nothing. It makes you look better. Ironically, it sometimes obscures what's not really happening.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking about starting points rather than endpoints. Moving to the next slide, this just gives us a sense of what our board chairs and executives telling us about the extent to which board members are prepared for meetings and that they receive the information that they need. And part of what I think is sort of interesting about these findings is that some of the variances here are higher than we see in other places in the study. It's not the most striking variances, but there are bigger ones, particularly on the level of preparation than we're seeing in most of the questions between chairs and executives. And moving to the next slide, one of the things that we contemplate in the study is, is there a potential blind spot here? So the combination of the variance and then the fact that chairs were saying that it was quite important based on their responses that they had the information that they needed to make decisions and the time to read and prepare for the meeting. Is there a potential blind spot here for executives that are underestimating or undervaluing how important that is to a board member's ability to really engage meaningfully? And I'm curious what you all think about that.
I'm not sure about the blind spot. I'm seeing a lot of boards, they're much more vocal about what they need and when they need it. And I think those are conversations that are definitely happening more frequently. So not sure about the blind spot there.
I think part of the blind spot that I'd highlight is hidden within parts of this. When I looked at this slide and thought about what the study said, I'm reminded of variations in information processing and learning styles. And the question that occurs to me, ironically, standardized structures undermine this, is are boards and executives, or board leaders and executives, providing information of the right sort in the right way to help the variety of different styles around the table engage and work together? And I like the idea of using dashboards, for example. They're good at focusing attention. They standardize and give you a trend line for how to judge key indicators. And the power of deciding what is in a dashboard is a huge benefit to a board and an organization. But the truth is, different learning styles engage this information in different ways, and they can't value it or add some of the value they could from it if it doesn't meet their needs. I'm reminded of John Carver's admonition a long time ago that, you know, the only information that should go to boards is either decision-making information or monitoring information. And so, you know, having folks parade in front of the board and tell them about the prototypical client who we helped last month, that's all incidental. We should moderate that or get it out of the meeting. But you know what? There's a whole lot of folks for whom that's the way they can begin to engage what's going on in the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, missing that sense-making role of the board as well, and what enables board members to really make sense of the organization's work and its operating environment, and how different that can be for different board members.
But Dave, if I were to ask you,
I just want to say really quickly that I think that this idea of a dashboard and the board being involved in the development of the dashboard actually in and of itself causes a higher level of engagement, because the information that they've asked for, that they've decided is important to them, is being presented. And that is such a generative activity in itself. And one that they can play with through the years. If they find that they don't ever discuss a particular aspect of the dashboard, they may want to replace it with something that is important that they will discuss. And it's a much more a partnership kind of methodology than simply deciding they need this material. I'm just going to present them with this big old board book every single time, and if they don't read it, I'm going to blame them for not understanding the strategy of the organization. And I've seen that happen so many times. It's just it's well structured and it doesn't work. So this idea of something being well structured or structured to the kind of umpteenth degree and still not working, those two things can very easily coexist. So I think it's in the type of structure that it requires people to think about the questions that they want to work on from the beginning, and then throughout the process that you begin to see what you want to see in the board, which is that kind of sense of dynamism and excitement.
So I think building on that, so not contradicting anything that's been said, but I do see the big old board book going away. And I do see, or I hear from more organizations that are inquiring about board portals. And there's definitely a different type of conversation that's taking place. Instead of just accepting whatever the executive director wants to give the board, there are more conversations about exactly what you said, Dave. What do we need? How much of it? What type of information is going to help us make the decisions that we need to make? So there's more negotiation happening there. So when I initially responded and I said, I'm not so sure about the blind spot, I think that in that respect, yeah, we're no longer getting the 3-ring binders and just accepting that and kind of trudging through it. I think boards are more informed, or at least asking about different approaches, different ways to receive information. You're absolutely right. Some want charts and graphs. Others want data or bullet points, and they're having these conversations.
One of the nice things about portals is that they do allow more responsiveness to a variation in needs or interests.
And that's exactly the point that Leading with Intent is trying to make in terms of the interpretation of these data points is, if you're not having that exchange, that conversation back and forth about what does the board really need in terms of information and insight to be able to have meaningful conversation and do its strategic and generative work, you need to ask, you need to engage in that as a chief executive. You need to engage in that conversation and start that exchange yourself, because just leaving it based on what you think the board needs to engage effectively is probably likely a huge mistake. And so that's really what we're talking about with that potential blind spot. I'm going to move us to the next slide, which looks at board size over time. And again, I want to make that caveat. This is not a longitudinal study, so these are the folks that were in the survey in these years. But there does seem to be, and we lost our slide, so we'll bring it back. There you go. There does seem to be, at least in these snapshots, a movement toward smaller boards. You can see in 2017, the average board size of all of the organizations that was surveyed is 15. And when we first did this research in 1994, the average was 19. Moving ahead to the next slide, we look at how board size is related to other board structures. So the first column there is the number of meetings per year, the length of meetings, and then what I find particularly interesting is looking at average attendance. And I find it fascinating that as you look at board size and average attendance, there seems to be quite a striking inverse relationship there. I'm just interested in sort of inviting some conversation here about what you all take from this and what that might be telling us.
Burnett, it looks like you have something to say.
Actually, I was thinking, well, if you're a board of one and you don't show up, it's noticed. So I was looking at the top line. So certainly the smaller, what I take from this is that I think organizations have figured out how to engage smaller boards, and the smaller boards probably feel as though they are more engaged. There's an opportunity to really speak, to have the conversations that you can't have when you have over 40 people in the room. So it's workable. And I was just thinking, in terms of attendance and looking at those numbers based on board size, that's the first thing that jumps out. Because for individuals, when they show up, they want to be engaged. People are busy, they're overscheduled. You can't just participate in something and not feel that it's a good use of your time. And sometimes when if there's a larger board, and you're absent, it might not even be noticed.
Yeah, those things are very consistent with the research on groups and teams, and frankly, also volunteer engagement. And board members are volunteers, even if they're usually operating at the policy level. One of the things I remember from the volunteer research is that people join in an activity because they want to feel connected to it, they care about the mission, they get to do things that they want to do. Over time, that calculation turns to a cost-benefit analysis. Does it make any difference if I'm here? Did I make any difference? Or was it somewhere between irrelevant or even counterproductive? And we know that smaller groups are more likely to function well as teams. To go back to that earlier team point, the diffusion of responsibility that occurs when you have 20, 30, 40 people, it just doesn't have the kind of accountability that is essential to true team performance and effectiveness. And of course, to go back to that earlier point, the structure that results in a board having 50 people pretty much tells me that the design principle there was to get enough bodies with big enough checkbook to meet a fundraising goal, and to maybe to reach out and bring other people in as well. I think we need to think about one other aspect as we're looking at board size. I sometimes feel it's important to differentiate your system of governance from the board itself. Effective boards can be very well engaged in their community with fairly small size if they have true connections, essentially functional connections, with advisory councils and collaborating entities out in the community they exist to serve. And you don't need to have all the action happen in the board meeting and board room. And so part of what I see with effective boards that are shrinking their size is that they're still engaged in the community. And the way they're doing it is by making true legitimate use of advisory structure without having to place the legal demands of the board governance role on all the people who frankly offer more value in the process by sharing program interests, community imperatives, all of those things that are fundamentally about mission versus oversight and internal accountability. I mean, there's still accountability there, but it's going to be about serving in the community and impact there.
And I know that's something just around that message, something that MPQ, you wrote about that for almost an entire year, governance, what was it, beyond the borders or the boundaries, and looking at community engagement, and thinking of how so much happens outside the boardroom that influences the decisions inside, but also how organizations are structuring themselves to invite in those external voices.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. One of the things that you can do, for instance, when you have a smaller board and kind of a lot of committees that are charged with doing particular time-limited things like finding a new facility, deciding whether or not to partner with a particular other group in the community. When you have groups that are charged with those kinds of things, you can actually test out potential new board members in those groups, and you'll be able to see, do they act well in the boardroom? Do they, is there some kind of habit that would possibly disrupt good discussions, in the boardroom? Those kinds of things come through very strongly in the committee structure, and so it provides this very nice recruitment pool, so that you're not just reaching out to friends of friends of the board, that you actually do have kind of a bigger and more tested pool. But the other thing is that it does provide you with kind of an unlimited bunch of friends who know the internal workings of your organization, and those people can not only protect you, but they can be called in when you need them as resources. And so it's really a kind of, this governance beyond the board thing is a very special way of doing business that it could function with a smaller governance board. So I think it's a very promising structure in and of itself. But you have to kind of get out of the obsession with the board itself to get to that larger scheme of governance. And then you have to reconceptualize what that board is doing to some extent.
Right. Well, and part of the principle there is in what ways and how do we engage the community, the key constituents and stakeholders. And it's an illustration of where structure will shape the culture as well. And you can use that structure of the extended committees, task forces, those kind of entities to build relationships and then keep more of a porous boundary, if you will, as opposed to, frankly, treating the board like a very insular star chamber kind of a creature where we all go cloister ourselves away somewhere, and then we'll make those key decisions and then we'll announce them to the community, and they'll love it or hate it, or maybe they won't care if you're lucky. But increasingly in today's world, people also do want engagement, and so they're going to look at your structures and say, what does that tell us about your principles and values for engagement and responsiveness, as well as accountability?
And I think that's a really interesting sort of dynamic when you look at these systems of governance, because I totally agree with you, Ruth, that they can be really, really powerful, but they can also be used as a way to sort of keep folks out of the real power and leadership of an institution, which of course is not what you're suggesting in terms of the goal, but can easily happen if you're thinking, you know, essentially, how do we outsource community connections, or how do we outsource diversity, or how do we outsource, you know, anything that we don't want to, or we're resisting including as a part of the board, but we're going to say we can find it through this other way. So that's sort of the caution that I would give to boards thinking about those systems is, you know, think about the values, as you've said, Dr. Enns, you know, think about the values and principles that are guiding your decision making about this structure, and make sure you're checking yourself about them, and you know, really thinking, is this the right decision for us, or are we doing something or avoiding something that, you know, really we need to take a closer look at. Going to the next slide, leading with intent does offer some perspectives, and these are not data driven. This is really about BoardSource's experience, but some advice of, you know, when might your board be too small and when might your board be too big. So many of the points that we've already made in terms of expertise and perspective, the idea that you need to have a strong enough board and a big enough board that it can really maintain independence or exert influence and balance to the chief executive, and have the access to the networks that you need. Though certainly this concept of the system can help there a lot. And that a board might be too big, as we've talked about, if there are too many board members to really engage, that real deliberation sits with an executive committee, which is something that can easily happen when you've got a larger board, is essentially, you know, you've got a board that is no longer the board, the executive committee is the board, or that board members are otherwise disconnected from the board's governing role. Looking at the next slide and shifting a little bit away from board size, the study Leading with Intent also looked at term limits. And again, not a consistent sample, but it does seem that over time there is greater adoption of term limits, with 72% of boards reporting that they have term limits in the 2017 study. I'm going to breeze through these a little bit and give us an opportunity to kind of comment on all aspects of them as we near the 3 o'clock hour. So looking at this next set of findings around committees, also seeing that the average number has gone down significantly from when we first started looking at these snapshots. We were at 6.6 in 1994. The 2017 study finds that the average number of standing committees, so not task forces or time-bound advisory groups, down to 4.5, with the most common committees being, as you see, executive, finance, governance, and fundraising. Moving to the next slide, one of the things that BoardSource talks a lot about, and I'm interested in getting your perspectives on this, is, you know, when do you really need a standing committee versus a time that you need another solution, because there can be, and this is something that we see, of course, a lot, you know, sort of an over-dependence or an over opting into creating standing committees when really it's not something that requires one. So at BoardSource, we talk about the fact that a good case for a standing committee is if you really do have an ongoing need for board work on a particular issue or set of issues, and that the work can be effectively delegated to a smaller group of the board, rather than something that really does need the full board's engagement. And then I won't read, but just all of the potential scenarios where it's really not the right solution to develop a standing committee. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I've seen a real push and a lot of positive response to the notion of task forces, time limited structures. And I've seen people resist board participation or board membership because of the additional demands of committee activity and, frankly, the poor integration of these two layers of structure, the board versus the committees. And I think too many boards have failed to really decide, consistent with your points here, what makes sense. And I guess I'd like to make the point here, applies to many things that have come up, that what your design is shouldn't be and usually can't be forever. And I see this with committees, for example, with term limits and other things. Bylaws aren't forever. Bernetta made the point earlier about young organizations early on and how their needs and their demands and structures should and could evolve over time. And that's really pretty critical. I mean, the world is changing, the world's evolving, and structures, and by that I mean bylaws too, especially, they're not forever. And of course, a lot of groups cope with that by ignoring them, as opposed to constructively thinking through what's our next generation of work, the challenges we're confronting. How do we, in principle, design a structure that will give us the most flexibility and still help us get things done? And then you write your bylaws to codify what you've decided. And that's when the structures appear. They're not magical to begin with. Sometimes they're never magical. But
I love your term, the next generation of work. I'm going to start incorporating that and using it because it's a nice framing, and I think people intrinsically get what that means. When we talk about structures, and you mentioned the bylaws, which we didn't talk a lot about today, but I'm surprised at how many boards I encounter that what we think of as a relatively simple act in terms of amending the bylaws. For them, if it's in the bylaws, it might as well be written in stone. So there's no, it takes no realization that, you can change that. And for organizations that are reviewing their bylaws or just starting out and drafting the bylaws, I like lean bylaws. Don't try to document everything in the bylaws because there is, for whatever reason, this reluctance to pull them out, dust them off, and change them as the organization changes and the need arises. So committees, and you said, what do we think of this? I love task forces because, again, I think about board engagement. I'm always thinking about that. And board members like this sense of being able to dig into something, roll up their sleeves, produce something, and it's like, hey, I did it. I made a contribution. And it's not to say that that's the end of their work, but that's a real sense of satisfaction when you know that you've been able to deliver on something. I know in one of our publications, I'm not sure which one, we talk about zero-based committees, and it's an exercise where once every couple of years, you theoretically get rid of all of your committees. And when I say theoretically, it's more about the conversation of if we were starting today, what committees would we need and why? So you see if some of those committees come back, or maybe they go away and you create new ones. But being able to look at something with a fresh eye. And I think that's also where the next generation of work comes in, because if you're looking at something anew, you have to think about where you're headed. And so you can stop looking in the rear view mirror and having this baggage that you inherited when you joined the board.
I know we're right at 3 o'clock and that we want to move to questions, but I do want to just share one more slide which highlights the importance of the governance committee, which of course for most boards or boards where there is a governance committee is the body that's charged with really leading and helping to ensure that these conversations about thoughtful structure are happening. So you see here some of the questions in Leading with Intent related to board culture and board self-management, which really is the function of that governance committee and sort of the brain power behind how do we make sure that form is following function instead of the other way around. So Ruth, let me hand it back to you if we want to take some questions.
Perfect. And we do have some questions that that very much speak to some of the things that you were talking about. So I want to go just for a second to this idea, and David, you addressed this just a minute ago, of whether or not the structures of boards change over time, and with the age of the organization and the stage of development. Could we talk about that a little bit? Like, you know, we do see very different boards in some small organizations than large organizations, but also there is a sense that there is one right kind of board. What do we generally see in terms of a development process of the board, and is that written in stone?
Well, I think my experience is that people, when they start an organization, they just come together and they're trying to get things done. They're usually in sync with the founder, or maybe they collectively are the founders. And so they're going from there. And in some ways, that's the most magical time because people are actually connected with the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And the conversations tend to be more oriented that way. I don't think anybody's actually joined a nonprofit board saying, boy, I hope we get to go buy insurance. I think maybe we could create a payroll system. I mean, some people are better or worse at doing that, but I haven't met many who joined for that reason. But as time goes on, and as the organization develops and grows, it needs to get more developed and differentiated. We get more skilled and sometimes professional about the individual functions that used to be all in one person's head or a couple people's head. And then we start to see boards evolve and develop as they should, because the work that they need to be doing to help advance the mission is getting more sophisticated, complicated, and demanding. That maybe means more committees. I find people often assume it does, and so we start to see that big development. One of the principles, though, in the organization design world that most people I don't think are aware of is anytime you create some form of specialization or differentiation, in other words, going from just the board to having a finance committee, an HR committee, a fundraising committee, a marketing committee, when you differentiate, you must create ways to keep that work integrated or reintegrated. And ideally, that happens at the board level. And of course, we see places where it doesn't happen at the board level. You have little feudal kingdoms around certain functional work, and then they fight over who's more important. The more committees you have, the less likely the board is able to work as a team unless you've really been thoughtful about that integration process.
How about you, Vernetta?
Yeah, one of the things, so you asked, you know, does the board change or should it change? Absolutely. And where that becomes most apparent is if you ever work with an organization that's like a nonprofit that's 100 years old, that's an institution. And when individuals join those boards, it's not so much joining the team as it is becoming a part of the institution. So when I talk about things being set in stone, it is hard, it's very difficult to bring that fresh lens or really having the discussions about changes that could be made so that, and again, all in the interest of mission, but recognizing that so much has changed around them over the years. So it's a lot of holding on to things and it becomes harder. I think I may have mentioned this on our last webinar. If not, I'll just mention it here. For the past year, I've served on the board of a startup organization, and becoming a part of this organization, for one, not only did I believe in the mission, but I wanted to have that experience again of working with an organization that's new. And it's been very invigorating in terms of how nimble it is. So when I think of, boards, do they change? Can they change? I'd say the older they get, it's just like people who get set in their ways. It's the same. I see the same thing with organizations, but they should constantly be thinking about how to refresh so that they don't become stagnant. That last, I know in one of our life cycle charts, there's a space holder for stagnation saying you don't have to go there, but if you're not paying attention to your board, your organization, and what you're doing, that's where you'll end up.
Yeah, I think it's, I think what you guys are saying is so important. I do think there's this tendency when you pull the discussion of the contents of one bucket of work out of the rest of the organization, it tends to stay pulled out a little bit. And so it never quite reintegrates back if you keep it out too long. And one of the things that it seems to argue for more temporary committees, more ad hoc committees, because it means that you wouldn't necessarily keep that conversation or the details of that conversation pulled out of the whole team. So it's one of the things that happens to large organizations internally as well, that you tend to see after they reach a certain phase of development, they kind of fall apart into fractions of themselves and they never quite create the whole again. And that's a difficult thing to reorient from, because
so
I
also think that's, sorry,
turf oriented.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to make the point that I think it's not disconnected from the idea of meeting structure as well, because if you have a meeting that is structured around the committee's work too much, then that reinforces this sense of we're a bunch of small groups and we're kind of the meetings are the show where the small groups present their work, instead of the meetings being the place where the full board is doing the work that the full board needs to do. And I think you can have committees work incredibly well for long periods of time if they are truly, sort of doing the work in the committee that makes sense there, but then the board still has really strong full board work that it's doing well together. And that's about meetings being structured the right way, in my opinion.
Right. So there's the, I can bet that you all anticipated this question is, what about executive committees?
Anybody want to jump in there?
Go ahead. Whoever wants to jump in first.
I'm going to look at you, Anne.
Well, I'll share what BoardSource says about executive committees. We're not necessarily for or against them, but we encourage organizations and boards to exercise great caution around them because of the tendency or the potential for executive committees to become that board within the board and to really usurp the work that the full board should be doing. And so, thinking about what's the real need for an executive committee, and is there one, before you automatically create one. And then if you do see a need for one, making sure that is really power that's checked and that it does not become a decision-making body instead of the board, which is so incredibly easy to happen, particularly when you have a larger board, because it becomes much easier for the executive, the board chair, and others that are part of the executive committee to treat that as the place where the real action is happening, because it's an easier size structure to really have those deep, meaty conversations.
Right.
Agreed.
I
Yeah,
think, you know,
executive committees really should be a reflection of a unique set of needs for the organization. And especially today with digital technologies and the kinds of support we have for communications, the question comes up, what kind of environmental situation, that organization design notion again, what are the conditions that would warrant having that kind of structure within the structure? And frankly, I mean, I agree. I've called committees that you were just talking about weak executive committees. Of course, the committees who hear that don't like that. But you can structure accountability for that thing back to the board, but a lot of them don't. It sounds weird to say it, but I like the obligation of an executive committee to report back to the board and secure ratification for any formal action it's taken while the board wasn't in meeting. And you can't unring a bell, but if the full board looks at the executive committee and says, that really shouldn't have happened, that helps create a form of accountability that I think is really important. And to go back to the core legal structure, which isn't going to change, it's the full board that's legally accountable for what's done in the name of the organization, whether you were allowed into the conversation or not.
That's exactly what's going to be one of my points, is that actually a strong executive committee can leave the rest of the board really in a difficult legal position, because they are responsible for a decision, and yet maybe they didn't know exactly what decisions were being made in their name. And so they kind of deputize a committee to do a particular set of things without necessarily having to come back to them for a ratification, or not having things really fully explained to the whole board, and then they get surprised. I remember one organization in Tennessee that where almost everybody on the board expressed surprise at the executive salary, because they literally did not know what that salary was. And when they were asked why didn't they know, they said, well, that was the executive committee's decision. And there were two people on the executive committee. They knew, the rest of the organization didn't, but that board looked like a set of fools. And so the question is, how embarrassed do you want to be at a set of decisions that have been made in your name that you're responsible for, but not, you didn't really know about? I think this gets back to this idea of design. Are you designing accountability in or out? Are you designing care in or out? What exactly would cause you to set up an executive committee that would make decisions outside of a board, an overall board structure? So I think that it's a great question, David. Why?
It's a carryover. It's a carryover from the early days, and I actually mean like a century ago, in terms of how we were founding and setting up our organizations. Was the example you gave, Ruth. Having the executive committee was a smaller problem in the bigger picture of understanding what the board was responsible for. And it's interesting. So and I want to, when you were talking, Dave, something came to my mind. I've seen a couple of organizations where it's not so much decisions being made in secrecy, but the conversations and what's getting vetted in the executive committees, not being willing to part with that particular structure, but as a way to acknowledge, okay, some people may feel included, So we're going to provide notice of the executive committee meetings and anyone can attend. Does that solve the problem? That's the question.
I think it communicates a willingness to be more accountable. I think it still raises the question of why you would do it. And,
Yeah.
you know, there are
Like we can't
certain circumstances where you need the capacity at the board level, especially if there's a legal structure within which the board's going to have to act. So, you know, I mean, a tornado comes by and it tears the back wall off the shelter. You want a group that can act quickly to make sure that, you know, they respond and they contract with a service to take care of it. But then you go back and close the loop. I think when you're beyond emergency kinds of conditions, it's almost never really legitimate to have a committee doing these things.
Right. So I want to move along. We've damned executive committees again, once again. That voice is getting louder.
But they're the most common. I mean, in that statistic in the report.
I know. Okay, so I want to go on and just I've gotten a bunch of questions here asking you to describe what a board portal is and what a dashboard is. So who wants to do what? Portal? Who wants to describe that?
Netta, you brought those
A portal. So actually, there are some companies that have software that provide that you can use. An organization can use, purchase a subscription where your board members will receive a secure login. And in the portal, imagine it kind of like a file cabinet. So the organization can post documents and board members can view them at any time. They can carry on conversations. You can have your historical documents like your bylaws, your charter, etc. But also as materials are ready for meetings, it's posted to the portal. So we're saving trees in terms of the actual paper, but a nice convenience of it is really having access to materials in an orderly fashion, and you can go back. So you want to see what was in the minutes and you didn't keep that information. It's all in an organized fashion, just like a file cabinet, but also the conversations that can happen in that portal. It's a convenience factor. So organizations are really kind of latching on to this.
Yeah, and I would just add, given the point that you made previously that prompted the discussion of portals for Netta, I think the nice thing about a portal is it can enable a board to separate those things that are essential for a particular meeting and, you know, sort of reference materials, because a lot of those big board books that are so overwhelming, you know, half of it is a bunch of stuff that comes with every board book. So I think that's the potential, just from a structural perspective, benefit of the portal, is that it enables you to really focus board members on, these are the things for this board meeting that you need to be prepared and have read.
So I want to just talk really quickly about dashboards. I'm a big proponent of dashboards. And dashboards are really tailored to your own particular organization and what's important for your organization to do next. So it's very much key to your business model, your enterprise model. It may track program issues, it might track financial issues or other kinds of things. So just as an example, NPQ has a dashboard. We track the number of people that come to webinars. We track the number of people who read our daily newswire, and we know at this point, because we also track our revenue, how that relates to our earned revenue. And so we have some sense of what the formulas are that we have to hit to kind of manage the way we work. And if those change, if all of a sudden we realize that there isn't any more relationship between the number of people who are reading our newswire and our earned income, then we have to go back and ask other questions. So it's really just this very structured method of asking and answering questions that the board does itself. And then you just set up some visual trackers that everybody can have in front of them every single month or every time you meet, that allows you to see whether you're hitting the marks that you set at the beginning of the year. And even if you're not, you have a discussion around them. So that's what a dashboard is.
And I would just add there, we use a dashboard as well and find it to be extremely helpful, and include the things that you've mentioned, our version of them, but we also include elements of the dashboard that are specific to the board's work, and have found that that is extremely helpful as well, or can be. You know, so questions from board meeting evaluations in terms of the value or the quality of the meeting, questions related to the board's engagement in various areas, things around tracking board attendance. So anything that you want to be able to reflect on and show movement over time can sometimes be very helpfully captured by a dashboard.
Right. It's a great focuser, and it can be used also. It can be used as a discussion piece with boards, but also with staff, with funders. I mean, it can really be used fairly broadly. So I want to just move now to asking each of you. There's one question that I thought that maybe each of you could answer, which is, what do you see as emerging thoughts about board structure that people should be paying attention to? What are the next generation of thoughts about board structures? And maybe we'll start with you, Vernetta.
The next generation of board structures. I think the next generation of board structures, I'm going to hold out hope that this current generation will get on board with this idea of being nimble, this idea of, and it's going to have to happen. I'm going to hopefully my remarks will tie together, but this is something that I think about. We're seeing research where we know that millennials and younger individuals aren't interested in serving on nonprofit boards. And part of that is the structure, how we meet, how we operate, or how organizations meet and how they operate. So this next generation of structure, if we want to continue having boards, and there's certainly value there, we have to figure out how we're going to engage individuals in a way that does not feel archaic. And that's going to push some boards out of their comfort zone. And there are a number of areas that might impact, whether it's when they meet, how they meet, use of technology, that has to be a part of it. And when I say how long they meet, I'm not just talking about whether it's an hour. There's organizations that will meet for days at a time. And when I think of next generation and how people engage, how they want to have their volunteer experience, is something that's very different from the way nonprofits have traditionally structured themselves and the way they're currently operating.
Right.
Those are my comments.
David?
Yeah, what she said. But I would go back to my early comment, which is, I think we're going to see good boards getting more thoughtful about the principles that inform the choices they make, and we will see them be nimble in the ways that Vernetta's talked about, but that will include being responsive to when and how people who are our next generation of board members are willing to and want to be engaged. I think we'll see less structure, but more engagement, because you can use things that are they're hidden structures like social media and certain things that allow some things the board meetings are used for now to be shifted to another venue. And the board portal idea is like that too, because we're going to find that in order to get the people we need, we have to have meetings that truly capitalize on the synergy of when we're together and keep the other stuff outside so that people, but make it accessible so people can check in, get the information they need, and be committed enough that they will show up for the real value-adding experience. But that's the real substantive discussion.
Yeah, and I would piggyback. I completely agree. And I think the thing that I would add, or just make a fine point around, is the changing relationship that we as people and individuals have to our time. And I think that's going to really drive a lot of change in terms of the way that boards operate. And it's not necessarily new structure, and it's not even necessarily new concepts, because it's exactly what we've been talking about in terms of what boards should be doing for a long time, in terms of how they're spending their meeting time and how they're engaging board members. But I think that as folks have less and less patience for wasted time, or the sense that, you know, it doesn't matter if I was here, or why did I fly across the country for this, or I could have done this via phone, there's going to be more pressure, as you said, David, to really make meaningful the time that boards have together. And I think that could be a very, very positive sort of instigator for positive board change. It could also push some boards into this, you know, I'm not willing to spend time on it and it's not going to change, so I'm going to make it that, you know, hour-long meeting where nothing actually really happens. So that would be my caution, is that that trend could take us that way as well.
Thank you guys very much. This is obviously, new forms of governance is a work in progress. We're all responsible for them. And we did see all of your questions that we have not yet answered. We're going to hold them. What we tend to do when you've asked us questions that we have not yet answered is to make sure that we keep them moving forward. So the next time we structure a webinar, we'll make sure that those questions are integrated in. So thank you very much, Vernetta, David, and Anne. I'm getting a lot of really lovely, well done webinar, very informative. Thank you, great discussion notes from those who participated, and not that many people dropped off after an hour, so you must have done a really great job. And we will be back with the third and fourth of this series, and hope to get just deeper and deeper as we go along. So thank you very much, and we will see you soon.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.